Hi out there, everybody. Well, we have another special edition here today concerning the Ukraine situation and how the Western media is handling it. And with us are some familiar faces, circular here. John Woodford at the top of the screen beside me, and then Mark Collinsworth towards the bottom, and Kent Garrett. And you could get their backgrounds in the introduction I'll write to this. And of course, Larry Sparano, that's me. Of On Target with Larry Sparano. Now, first of all, guys, it looks like it's getting bloodier and more brutal in Ukraine. And my question is, whose fault is it? Are the Russians really doing this, or are the Ukrainians using, in effect, human shields by getting civilians to fight in the cities and firing on the Russians who have to then fire back? Does anybody have a reading on what the real situation is? Anybody?
Well, I mean, it's a horrible mess all the way around, but I think no matter what, the bear was being baited through NATO, sure, but nobody had to go in. It wasn't really I don't think it was an existential threat that Ukrainians were posing to the Russians. So I think they have to take responsibility for ramping up and making a scale of assault on another country the way they have. There are many ways that they could have continued to fight back against either NATO and whatever was done as far as NATO, and also even as far as those Russian enclaves in Ukraine. It certainly didn't require this scale of an operation. So on that score, I would say that Putin has to take responsibility, and those around him. I don't know how they work over there with the Putin, but it's not just one person. Obviously, you got to have a committee. A little group of people have to agree, because if these are people with backing and following and forces, especially in the military and the police, and since Putin comes out of a military police background, I guess he's sort of as if someone like J. Edgar Hoover got control of the United States in a way. If you did something that was too much threatening, then you have the oligarchs, so-called. We don't, they never call them oligarchs when they're Americans, but their variety of oligarchs, unlike ours, you have those people involved funding things. So whoever does anything over there has got to see whether he's going to be assassinated if he screws up or not. We'll find out.
Well, John, what you just said brings up another question that deserves a little further explanation, I think, exploration. Is Ukraine that much of a threat to Russia? Now, Putin says that it is, that, for years now, they've been assaulting eastern Ukraine, and also they're getting more and more associations with Western powers. They want to bring in NATO, supposedly, and that would be more of a threat to Russia on its border. So Putin is saying that this really is a serious threat, and he was forced into this move because they didn't want to negotiate any of that about NATO and what the forces that are being brought in there, and the assaults on the Russian ethnics and Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. So his back was against the wall. And I read the statement that he made that the American media is portraying as deranged and paranoid and delusional. And what he did was just lay out, I thought, fairly accurately what's been going on with Ukraine and the West. So anybody else have thoughts?
Well, it takes two to, Ukraine can't join NATO just because it might, if it wants to, just like they can't even have a fly zone that they're calling for. It takes what NATO has its own things, but its own choices. And if obviously NATO is way more powerful than the forces in NATO, I think it probably really boils down to something that's going on with that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and maybe at some point the United States got the Germans to indicate that that thing was not going to go through and provide the money and influence that Putin and his backers have been dreaming of getting. And I think that would be the only kind of threat or event that would precipitate them to do something as rash and violent as this operation. That's my
I
suspicion.
mean, I haven't heard any reports about Ukrainians using human shields at all. And where did you hear? I haven't
You
heard
know,
anything
what
about
I'm
that.
saying is, Ken, by Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, requiring all males between the age of 18 and 60 to stand and fight, and they're handing out
Right.
guns indiscriminately. And the way I understand it is from non-Western sources. You know, I'm trying to assess the accuracy of each side here. The way I
Right.
understand it is, you know, as the civilians are firing on Russian soldiers at times are being forced to fire back, but Putin has been trying to avoid civilian casualties, not necessarily because of humanitarian interests, but because he doesn't want to enrage the population after he installs a new government, and he just wants to take as few civilian losses as possible. But they didn't go in there with that intention, the way non-Western sources are explaining it. Mark, what do you think?
Well, something I want to add on that, we're talking about misinformation, and everything, and Putin not wanting to upset, the civilian population. I'm sure you've seen the rumors about, Putin's been accused of using vacuum bombs and using cluster bombs here in the last 24 hours, which are both illegal under the Geneva Convention. And those are like a thermic bomb, the air fuel bombs or the vacuum bombs. Those are easy to find out. Satellites can detect those on, infrared imaging. So I think a lot of that's just misinformation. But yeah, if Putin doesn't want to uprage the civilian population, you definitely don't want to be using cluster bombs and vacuum bombs to do that. Those are some pretty nasty weapon systems there.
And the question is he actually using those? I mean, I don't think we could just automatically assume that the information we're getting from the Western media is accurate, or accurate on the other side as well. My point is that it's very difficult to determine, what the real information is, what the real dope is from either side. And
I would even add that, from my days in the Army, miscommunication and misinformation is definitely a strategy that's installed into the military system. So there's going to be some misinformation coming out. And the funny part about that, I'm sure you saw, CNN actually is going to abandon all of their news stations in Russia because they don't want to be punished under Putin's new rule on being arrested if you provide misinformation to the public.
Yeah. Now, of course, Putin could just also take advantage of that and nix anything that is real information as well. But I don't have that much faith that we're getting real information from CNN or MSNBC or any of those outlets. The Fox, I think, at least with Tucker Carlson, he's trying to play it a little straighter, but he's the only one that isn't on board with the narrative that's coming from Washington.
Yeah, but what about, Larry, the images that you're seeing on CNN and MSNBC? I mean, you think those are fake, or I mean, don't
Some
you?
are.
Well, there's some sources that are saying that actually it's the Ukrainians themselves, not the citizens, but the Ukrainians who've been given the business to Eastern Ukraine that are actually staging some of those hits and blaming it on Russia. And again, I'm not claiming truth from either side. I'm just saying, it's difficult to tell what the real story is. And you hear all these talking head generals and military people, saying that Putin's crazy. His statement was unhinged about Ukraine before he invaded, but none of them really quote that statement directly. And most people haven't looked at it. I've looked at it. It doesn't seem at all unhinged to me. So, and they say he stated that he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. I can't find that quote anywhere. You try to Google it. If it's there, it's buried, or actually what he said was buried. So I'm saying, who knows what is really going on there with either side? Don't forget, we've had Ukraine under our thumb for years, ever since we overthrew the Russian-oriented president there and installed our own puppet. So, a lot of this manipulation could be coming directly from the U.S.
We know that every kind of operator, not PR people connected with the military, there's a lot of money and reputations to be made by engaging in one of these war shows And we have that's what we have going on. They've decided, how to cast it and how to portray it. I noticed when, let's say, um, today, looking 18-month-old child dies because of a result of bombing, and they go to the hospital. Well, can you imagine how many 18-month-old children our ally Saudi Arabia killed in Yemen in one go around? They never go into the hospital there to bring out a Yemeni, Houthi mother whose children have died and go through one of these these stories to elicit sympathy for a cause. But that's what's going on here. And the Jimmy Dore show I looked at, they showed footage that CNN and others were using that had been done. Some of it came from other countries 3 or 4 years ago, certain kinds of footage. So this is in this day and age we live in, we're getting all sorts of fabricated, prefabricated, refabricated accounts aimed at molding popular opinion.
And also, John, Putin, he's a war criminal. He's a brute, this and that. Well, what about the carpet bombing, the napalm we use in Vietnam, other of these countries that we just took over? Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, this is a quote that may still exist on Google if they haven't scrubbed that, but a famous quote from her. She's being interviewed, I think, by Leslie Stahl, CBS.
Yep.
Stahl asked her if the American invasion of Iraq and the way we did it was worth the lives of 500,000 Iraqi children that died because of our brutal assault on Iraq. And she said, quote, "Yes, it was." So who's the war criminal here? Only Putin?
Yeah.
Country after country that we've taken over, the attacks have been brutal. Many.
I mean, I think, don't you think,
Yeah.
I think Putin has gotten a bit desperate. I think he's really losing from what I've listened to and read and seen. And I think the fact that he closed down Facebook is very significant. I mean, I think that is significant in terms of he's having trouble with his own population digesting what's going on.
Well, supposedly, and don't forget, the population isn't that well versed on what's going on in Ukraine as Americans aren't either. So, the military regimes in both countries are the ones that are really involved in this. The general populations really don't know a lot of these details. Again,
But I think what's happening in America with the Americans is that it's finally, in a way, in quotes, a moral situation, a right and wrong, a black and white, which has been presented, I would argue, by the media, and I think it might be right. But anyway, I mean, and that's what's driving the American objections to it, and people giving, funds and that sort of thing. And I think the Times said this morning that 16,000 American men had already volunteered and were on their way to Ukraine. So, I mean, I think it's I think that's Putin's in trouble in that sense, in the sense that I think what's happened, it's united much of America, and it's put the thing on a moral footing that people like. I mean, that Americans like, that they understand. I mean, I think we're sort of, I'm not saying we're in the weeds here, but I mean, I don't think the populace is as attuned as we are.
well, I mean,
You know what I mean?
that is a perception that it's a good war, it's a good cause, it's a moral.
Right.
But don't forget, we haven't heard anything about how Western Ukraine forces within the government have been attacking Eastern Ukraine, killing thousands and thousands of civilians in Eastern Ukraine. We've heard nothing of that. So I'm not justifying what Putin is doing, but it's not that it wasn't predicated by things that were a serious concern to Putin and to Russia. And again, looking at the map behind me here, you could see how they've already encroached on Russia's borders. Poland's a NATO member. All these other close by countries as well. And, if Putin's accusation is true that they're really trying to get NATO into Ukraine, in addition to the financial interests that we're using in Ukraine that work against Russia, and all the manipulation, and also forces, if we bring in, even without NATO membership, if we bring in more Western-backed forces and missiles, that is a threat to Putin. I could see that. I could see that argument.
Well,
And I'm not justifying the brutality.
and that's a good point that you bring up there, Larry. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, part of the gentleman's agreement, if you want to call it that, was that NATO would not expand any of those previous Iron Curtain countries like Poland and Hungary. They'd kind of be off limits to join NATO. And now here we are, in present day, and every one of those countries that were kind of that gentleman's agreement are now NATO countries. And I feel like, they've kind of pushed Putin. And it's not like this is the first time he said anything. Putin has begged and pleaded not to keep pushing the NATO border closer and closer to Russia. And his back's kind of been pushed to a wall. I mean, what do you do when your back's up against the wall? So not that I'm, saying that Putin's doing the right thing here, but it's not 100% his fault either.
Yeah,
Are you saying it's sort of akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis that we had years ago, and when is Russia sort of reacting as we reacted when the Cubans were putting in missiles in Soviet was putting in missiles in Cuba?
Well, yeah, that too. I mean, it always irritates me that the United States will say, "Hey, you can't do this because it's infringing upon our security." But if another country decides to stand up for their rights, now all of a sudden the United States is like, "Hey, that's the wrong thing to do." It's the hypocrisy here is so thick you can cut it with a knife.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cuban missiles were put there because the United States started putting missiles in Turkey.
right.
And they were not supposed to, that was seen as the threatening, aggressive kind of move. So they said, well, you're going to do that. We're going to put some just as close to you. And then, of course, the United States did agree at that time to take down the ones in Turkey.
That's right. And John, that was not very well publicized. That was done a while after Khrushchev withdrew his ship.
That's true. Right.
So
Yeah.
they did that quietly. Now, Putin was asking for the same thing, and they kept ignoring him. Because the neo-hawks, the neo-conservatives and the war hawks in Washington, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, figured this is their chance to really take control of that area and never have Russia emerge again, even without the Soviet Union satellites. They just wanted to really scrub.
Yeah,
and Putin's reacting to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, and Putin was, what Putin has been trying to negotiate was, withdraw your missiles, don't let Ukraine draw NATO, and things will be stabilized again. But they wouldn't listen to him.
But don't you think, Larry, that Putin could have done this in a different way? And given the fact that they have so much oil, he could have said to Europe, "Hey guys, we're not going to give you any more of our oil if unless you deal with this NATO situation."
They need the money. They need the money for, they need money.
They need the money for the oil, yeah.
Yeah, they don't have many resources to sell. But yeah, I mean, the fact is that Ukraine did have an administration that was playing off U.S. versus the Russians, and he decided he wasn't going to take NATO in. And of course, that's the government that we know that Victoria Nuland, operating for the United States, got knocked out of office. So they say they're there to defend democracy, but we already know that we knocked out the government that we didn't want and got these particular governments in. So this particular government in. And so it's not all just Putin's doing.
Yeah, you see, and they're talking about how Putin bit off more than he could chew. The advance hasn't been going the way he has. The way I read it, the advance has been slowed because he was reluctant to fire on civilian populations, at least initially, and that's why it got bogged down. So, if you look at it that way, he's taking on more hits than necessary because he's trying to avoid civilian casualties, at least up until now. But again, it's very difficult to tell what's really going on, especially with the Western media. You know, have you heard any sound bites from the Russian side on this? Not necessarily from Putin, but for any of the military people, any of the other Russian officials. You don't hear any contrary sound bites on American TV.
They try to select only those who are criticizing Putin.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they're sympathetic to anti-war and peacenik type groups who they never, very rarely give any kind of space or attention to here in our country.
Yeah.
But over there, they're going right there to talk to them.
Yeah, you know, this is another akin to one of my pet peeves that I keep talking about all the time, is how the media now has just become an arm of the government. You know, it's becoming more and more state media. You don't hear any independent reporting anymore. They're all, again, I keep using the phrase, they're all cheerleaders and propagandists. And Ken, you know that from way back when you were at CBS years ago. It wasn't like this, at least not to this extent. Now the news is so filtered and you know, so restricted, has to conform to the media, to the narrative, that there's no room for independent analysis without being called a Russian pawn or a terrorist, or, you know, all that phony.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you to an extent. I mean, but I think when the media gets into a war, it all becomes sort of, you know, going after clicks and going after viewers and all that, and they'll take it from either side. I mean, if it's whoever does the damage, I mean, they're going after pictures and video. So, I mean, I don't think it's totally, you know, one-sided, as you seem to be saying. But I think, as I say, I go back to this thing. It's become a morality play, and a situation where it's right and wrong, good and bad, black and white. And I think that's gonna really, when you look at the tea leaves, I think it's gonna really give Biden a lot of pressure to really escalate this thing. I think we're gonna end up eventually with a no-fly zone. I think we're gonna. And plus, I've been listening to some commentators say that there's a lot of covert stuff going on that we don't really know about.
Even mercenaries, you know, could be
mercenaries.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But Ken, you really think that we're going to establish and enforce a no-flight zone?
I think eventually, yeah. I think there has to, because especially as the number of civilians who are killed goes up. In other words, if it's to pick a number, let's say if it's 1 million people killed, 1 million white people killed who aren't, you know, brown or black or from Africa, the world is not going to stand for that. The world is not going to stand for that.
Well, here's the question.
The first couple of world wars.
What?
As they got used to it in World
Well,
War.
they didn't get used to it. We went
II.
in. I mean, they didn't get used to it.
Oh, the world can stomach a lot of people getting killed.
I think though, Kent does have a point about the racial component here, where Vietnam, all these Asian wars and all that, if they were not white people, the public just kind of said, well, it's necessary because the cause is correct.
Right.
If it's white people, you know, they look a lot like the American white population, then yeah, you know, people perhaps get, at least the white population gets a little more outraged. So I think you have a point there. But getting back to establishing a no-flight zone, with American jets enforcing that, now American and Russian jets and forces firing on each other, will that?
I think it would be a NATO, you know, a NATO no-fly zone. It wouldn't be solely Americans.
Well, even NATO.
NATO is just that's USA. Everyone knows that.
No, I know it is, but I'm saying just in terms of
NATO doesn't want to
public
risk a
presentation.
world war over Ukraine. I don't think.
Well, I agree with that, because if you put a no-fly zone and a Russian jet flies in that no-fly zone, you have your only two choices. You either have to shoot it down and start another war, or that no-fly zone basically becomes an open fly zone. That's really the two choices you have.
Yeah, but I think if you shoot it down, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that we go to nuclear war. It doesn't necessarily mean we go to war. I mean, I think there's
an awful lot of planes up there doing a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. They're not going to stay in. They're not going to stay over those borders either.
That's
Yeah.
right. I mean, if they're coming in from Poland and other borders,
They're going to go where those planes came from.
exactly. You know, this really could escalate out of control. And don't forget the crop of analysts and defense analysts we have in Washington. A lot of them are kids who grew up not when we grew up, when we had that real scare with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the constant worry about the Cold War. A lot of these idiots now in Washington think, well, you know, we could fight and win a limited nuclear war. There've been actual statements to that effect.
Yeah.
You know, are they
Yeah.
nuts?
Yeah,
Well, what do you think happens though? What do you think happens if the death count gets to, I don't know, 900,000, a million? I mean, what
I don't
happens
think
at that
it's-
point?
I
You
think,
don't think it's going to get to that?
yeah, I think what's going to happen is Putin now is going to be turning on the steam more and get it over with. And there will be more civilian casualties. There will be more infrastructure damage, but he's going to try to do it now with much more force to get it over with before it's a slow escalation of civilian casualties. So I don't think you're going to have, you know, months of slaughter of civilians. I think he's going to wrap this up maybe in the next few weeks for all intents and purposes. Now, there may be a resistance in the country, which could be a enduring problem for him. But in terms of taking the country over, you know, at least in terms of the government, I think he's going to try to get this done in the next few weeks.
Well, I think I mean, to me, I think what's alarming, or I don't know if the word is alarming, but the fact that these American guys are going over there to fight, to volunteer. I think what's going to happen pretty soon, some of these American guys are going to get killed,
Yeah.
and then we're in. Then you know, then it's a matter of protecting our boys and that whole.
Not with their mercenaries. These are
No,
regular.
but they're not going to. No, these guys the Times talked about aren't.
All right,
weren't
some are
mercenaries.
mercenaries and some are guys who.
Yeah, these were guys that were volunteered.
Think they want to have a fight.
No,
Yeah.
no, okay, yeah, but they're still Americans. Is what
Well,
I'm saying. Once
I don't
you
think
get
anyone's going to
Ameri-
be backing.
I think that's what's going to happen. I think eventually, in the next week, 2 weeks, some Americans are going to get killed over there, and that makes it a whole new ball game.
And
Don't you think?
what's Biden going to do then?
I don't think I think U.S. citizens probably already have been killed. People with dual citizenship.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah.
What do you
With professional military and these other people who are amateurs. Well, you know, this is just like in sports.
Yeah.
NFL, the professionals look at the things their way, and they don't look upon these amateurs as being in their league, and they are not in their league as far as knowing how to fight. You have you know, what kind of person is going over there? A lot of Americans don't even know what Ukraine was before, but you have some of Ukrainian background who might want to go over there and fight. Well, this has happened in a lot of, you know, various other wars, and I think that's a negligible political impact, really.
Well, how do you think it's going to play out? What's your scenario? What do you think?
I think, like what Larry said, I think the way it's going is that that the NATO elements are going to say, well, okay, Ukraine, maybe you can get your way out of this, or maybe you can't, but we're not going to, you know, we're going to send you weapons. We're going to do every kind of covert thing we can, but we're not going in there officially ourselves. So if you're able to deter them, more power to you. If not, you can enter the annals of lost causes and martyrs.
You know, it's interesting now, if Biden is going to gain or lose on this. Now, if it ends up being negotiated and Putin withdraws after he gets concessions about demilitarizing and de-westernizing Ukraine and missiles are withdrawn, then Biden will look good. It looked like he was a strong commander. He took these steps and Putin withdrew, so he beat Putin. However, if that doesn't happen, it doesn't come to a negotiated settlement, and Putin just takes over, and you know there's more infrastructure damage, more civilians killed, then I think Biden is going to look weaker than ever, and people are going to say that this was encouraged by his withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Taiwan is next. So I think this could go either way for Biden. It could be a plus or a big minus for him. What do you guys think?
I'm thinking, with all this stuff, China's military or their generals are looking back at everything, that all the sanctions, all the tactics, all the strategies that are being used against Putin. They're sitting in a room right now trying to game that system to figure out, if we take Taiwan, how are we going to be impacted with sanctions and stuff? How can we bypass those sanctions? They've used the SWIFT system, or limited Russia on the SWIFT system. But China has the SIP system, which is they're trying to use to take over SWIFT. But I think the key thing, if China decides to make a move on Taiwan, it's got to be such a violent and swift and quick move. It's got to be done in a matter of days, so it's done and over with, versus this thing in Ukraine's now just starting to drag out.
Yeah.
But I think, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's right. But I mean, I think in terms of China and Taiwan, I mean, I think China in general is going about its quote aggression and by just getting all these countries in debt, and that's how they're going to do it. They don't need to do it by military force necessarily.
Yeah, well, I think they may take over Taiwan by military force, but in terms of us trying to sway them through sanctions, I think it's a remote chance that that'll happen, because we're so damn dependent on China now, with trade, with manufacturing, with technology. China is a Frankenstein monster of their own creation, because they went out for the quick buck by outsourcing jobs and technology to China. So how could they disengage? How could they sanction them without America being deprived of all the products that we get from
China? No, I agree with that. I mean, I agree that China is probably not sanctionable given how its situation. But I think the sanctions can work in Russia. Don't you think they'll work eventually?
I think Putin gamed this all out with China ahead of time, and they figured they've had sanctions before, and go enduring. Don't forget, they made all these deals with China now to sell them oil and everything else, other commodities, and that'll keep the Russian war chest going. Unless it's a bad miscalculation on Putin, I'm not convinced that it was. It might be, but I'm not convinced it was. We don't have the evidence of that. The sanctions, I don't think, are going to have the effect. And Mark knows more about this. With SWIFT, it's only certain SWIFT banks that are excluding Russia. Correct, Mark?
That is correct. It's only certain banks, but like we usually say, Bank, which is Russia's largest bank. Yeah, they're under the SWIFT requirements, but what's stopping Cyberbank from going to one of the other Russian banks that's not been sanctioned against and do the transactions through that bank? But back to the stuff with the most effective way, I think, to win a war is to cut the cash flow off. But I haven't seen any kind of sanctions about stopping the purchase of Russian oil. You're paying Russia a cash flow to support their military.
Yeah. It's I just think our options are limited on sanctioning Russia, and especially China, and it's our own fault that it came to this point. Biden is talking now about controlling China and all that. I've said before, he was one of the biggest cheerleaders in encouraging China to become the monster that it is today. He was leading the charge to get them admitted to the World Trade Organization, given the most favored nation status. All through these years, now all of a sudden, he has to deal with China. It's a lot of baloney.
Yeah.
And if you put the sanction, if you stop buying the Russian oil, I think you've already seen the bulk of the damage. But oil traders are already starting to price that in. I was looking at the oil or gasoline prices in Great Britain this morning, and that's going at the equivalent of $8.22 a gallon right now in Great Britain.
Wow.
But
wow.
And that's because they're already starting to price in that they're going to cut off they're going to stop buying Russian oil. So it's already being priced in the market. So why not go ahead and cut it off now?
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, like up here in the Catskills, it's already up to $4 a gallon. I mean, just for regular unleaded. But why is the SWIFT thing just for a few banks? Why is that? What does that mean?
Because the only way that you can buy and sell oil is through the SWIFT system. So if you cut all those banks off the SWIFT system, then essentially you have basically sanctioned Russian oil.
Okay, I see what you mean.
If that makes sense.
Which Western Europe is dependent on, which we're dependent on to some extent. We're buying Russian oil more now than we were before.
Yeah, it's about 600,000 barrels a day.
Yeah, one of the wild cards here, though, is whether now that we're sanctioning the Russian oligarchs' assets, including their mega yachts and all that, I don't know how much power they have to depose Putin if we take their money away. Mark, what's your reading on that? Do we have the wherewithal to really hurt the Russian oligarchs to the extent that they'd want to overthrow Putin?
I don't think so. I'm sure you've seen where they've, taken their yachts and stuff like that, and they're trying their best to, but Bitcoin's rallied up on it. They're moving into Bitcoin, and it's not like, this Ukraine stuff hasn't been talked about for months and months. If you're a billionaire, you're a billionaire for a reason. You have to use a certain amount of risk management in your strategies to become that wealthy. I'm sure those billionaires have already tried to game the system to figure out what would happen and what they need to do to protect themselves. So at this point, unless you cut the head off and you take away the oil and just shut down the Russian oil purchases, that's really my thinking the only way that you can really sanction Russia.
And that's next to impossible to do under current circumstances, correct?
Well, it's near impossible, but your oil traders in Europe are already pricing that in. They've already, gas prices have gone up so much there. They're already anticipating that to happen. So if they've already moved the market on that anticipation, we'll go ahead and do it now. Who knows? Gas prices might actually fall because, the old saying, buy the rumor, sell the news. If they cut Russian oil off, it might actually cause prices to come down because it's already been priced in.
Right. Well, what about I think it was Hannity who said that a few days ago, and then what about the Graham would assassinate Putin, and then Hannity saying, let's just do something that can't be traced back to us and get it over with.
Well,
you guys have seen too many movies.
I think that's a bad idea. And the reason why I say it's a bad idea.
Both are a bad idea.
Well, yeah, and I'll use this, going back to World War II. There was actually 2 documented cases where army snipers actually had Adolf Hitler in their crosshairs and could kill him, and they had strict orders not to kill him because the U.S. military was so afraid who was going to be his replacement, because Hitler was making so many mistakes. They didn't want the guy to come in and replace him and start making all the right moves. So that's kind of the trade-off.
Yeah.
The devil you know versus the devil you don't know.
And also, this is also the American narrative now that Putin is insane. He's unhinged. He's nuts.
Right.
He's paranoid. Really? I haven't seen any sign of that over the years. Now, maybe he has changed, as they claim in recent times, but I think that's just more propaganda, that he's unstable. In other words, encouraging the oligarchs or the Russian military who may not be in love with Putin to remove him. I think that's what it's all about. But, he's been very calculating all these years. And in terms of him being angry and all that during his speech, out of frustration, because for years and years now, he's been trying to get this negotiated, and we've been ignoring him. We've been telling him to take a hike. So, he's at a point now where he's angry, but that doesn't mean that he's irrational.
No, they thought they were going to enter the gentleman's rich Western club of rich countries and their leaders, and they kind of got embarrassed because they got kind of humiliated. I mean, Yeltsin was put in, by the United States. In essence, they wanted Yeltsin in there because they knew that he would get rid of a lot of the state enterprises, and the private sector would start blooming. And Putin was Yeltsin's henchman. So it's not as if I see some of these guys who are volunteering now. They said they're going to go over there and and fight communism, or they're going to fight some kind of leftist conspiracy that they say Putin represents. Nothing's crazier. These people, that's so loony. But a lot of Americans think that that's kind of what's going on, and this is some kind of Soviet operation, and these are.
Yeah, but even
It's-
though, even I agree with you, John. But it's as I say, it's a clear-cut morality war that we've not had in a while. No, come on. I mean, Vietnam was controversial. Iraq was controversial. This is not, according to what
because
people where I live up here think. I mean,
well,
this is like
they're not getting a news. What if it was reported widely and often how the U.S. with Newland got that other government in there, and how they wanted to push NATO unnecessarily. NATO supposedly an alliance to stop the Soviets from spreading whatever it is they were spreading. What's going on? What's the motivation for NATO to treat Russia that way? Don't forget, Germany was treated very harshly after World War I.
Which is what led to World War II.
And
right.
people in a society that's being treated harshly, all sorts of various individuals and movements start popping up to get back and get on their feet.
But I think you guys are not in touch with the pulse of the American population on this one.
Well,
I think this is, and again, I'm not saying I agree necessarily. I'm just saying that it is a clear-cut situation which Americans like and which people respond to. And at some point, Biden's going to have to do something, especially if the death count gets up there. He's going to have to do something political to deal with it.
I agree with you that it's being perceived as a moral issue. All these images of these poor civilians, women and children trying to flee, people being bombed. Yeah, so it tugs at our hearts.
Right.
It's always bad when civilians have to go through this. So it's elevated as a moral issue, but that's not really the reality behind what led to this, which is being not talked about by the American media. And just like with the Second World War and Hitler. Well, what led to the rise of Hitler? It's the way Germany was treated with the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, and that gets the population so ticked off, social conditions deteriorate, so you have the rise of somebody like a Hitler. So, and all we heard about was Hitler was the Antichrist, Hitler was the demon. Yes, he was, but did we foster the rise of Hitler by treating Germany so badly after the First World War? And the answer is yes.
Yeah,
I mean, we could ease this very easily by getting into an agreement that says, all right, let's have an agreement, and at the end of this agreement, we're not going to be putting Ukraine in NATO. We're not going to be putting missiles near you, and then you're going to do something too. You're going to rebuild Ukraine, and you're not going to whatever it is. Anyway, they could get out of it if they want to get out of it. If there's a will to get out of this.
Yeah, and I think but the narrative is taken over. The war hawks have taken over, and don't forget, and Mark knows more about this, who will make money the more this war goes on, and that's Mark. Who's making the money? Who's going to benefit?
Be the defense contractors that basically specialize in basically Cold War technology, cybersecurity, the drones, stealth bombers, technology, the military technology defense contractors.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, why do you think he hit that nuclear plant? I mean, I can't figure that out. What was that all about?
I would assume it's to knock off the power to that area, not to expose radiation and all that. Don't forget, the initial reports were he's bombing the nuclear plant and the radiation.
Right.
Well, now that they have to admit that all he did is an auxiliary building that he hit. And I think he was just trying to knock out the power supply. And according to experts that I've heard, it's very difficult to bomb open a nuclear plant anyway because they're so hardened with the shells. And
Right.
he wasn't trying to do that. But again, the American media sees on this as another atrocity. What's he trying to do? Expose that entire region to radiation, blah, 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 blah. When it's
Right.
obvious, he was just I think he was just trying to knock out the power supply.
Well, and not to mention, if he did hit that nuclear base and release nuclear radiation, that's going to hamper his military in that same place. So, yeah, I think it's just propaganda to try to get people riled up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think they did get people riled up. I mean, the media.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's the narrative now on that. Either it was a mistake or it was just this part of his being crazy, you know.
Yeah. And again, you know, none of us are okay with the casualties that are going on, both military and civilian. I mean, it's horrible to see this, but we're trying to give it this more of a dimension of what led to this and what's really going on. You know, it's much
to be stopped. The sooner it's stopped, the better.
Yeah, much more nuanced than we're getting. But now, Ken, you still think that Biden's going to take some action getting us directly involved?
I think so. I mean, and I think there are two things happening. I think he's going to have to do that unless what's going on covertly that we don't know about works out, whatever that's going to be. If that works out, then he doesn't have to do anything politically. But at some point, he cannot live with, you know, or his government, his administration let 900,000 people die and did nothing about it. You know, again, white people die and did nothing about it. I mean, that's not a political reality he can deal with. So he'll have to maybe there's been some bipartisan support about you know, getting rid of not buying Russian oil at all. Maybe he goes that way. Maybe instead of a no-fly zone, maybe he just says, okay, we're not going to buy any more Russian oil, and that's going to be the ultimate sanction for them.
All right, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we stop buying Russian oil and, you know, it's cut off to Europe, we would have to reopen the American domestic production of oil, which so far is a non-starter for him because of the people that, you know, his environmental group that helped get him elected. So it doesn't seem like that could change unless it gets so desperate. He says, well, temporarily, we have to reopen the spigot in America to ease the pain and then go back to the restrictions. What do you think, Mark?
I don't think, I think Biden is so geared towards wanting to be, you know, the Democrat Party's become very green focused. I don't think he wants to drift away from that. He's trying his best to get America onto green technologies. And the only way you can really force a country on a green technologies is you've got to dramatically lower the oil supply or the oil supplies in the market. I don't think if you cut the Russian oil off, I don't think Biden would do anything to open up the U.S. oil spigot.
Well, then we're going to be paying what, $10 a gallon for gasoline?
No, we're going to be buying electric cars. That's what.
Yeah, that'll eventually force. My wife wants to go buy a Tesla because she's tired of filling up her gas tank. So it's starting to work.
Well, this is a good thing, really.
Well, there's people that say that's what this is all about, where they're forcing people into electric cars and the green technology. However, the problem there is that transition is going to take a while. What happens, you know, in the 3, 4, 5, 6 years or more until we switch over to alternative?
Right.
You know, they haven't talked about that. They don't calculate that in.
Or will they talking about all the toxic waste that's created from the making of the lithium batteries?
Yeah. And also, you know, the power plants that make the electricity are still depending on fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
Unless we go all nuclear, but you know, that's not on the horizon anymore. And don't forget, Germany shut down its nuclear power plants to become more dependent on Russian oil.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
So, all right, guys, closing remarks. John, what do you think is going to happen in the next 2 weeks to a month? How is this all going to end up?
I can't make any predictions. What with the human being and groups of human beings being the way they are and what they've done in the past, and I don't know what some kind of irrational surprise thing can pop up to change a lot of the behavior. Otherwise, I would expect some kind of settlement where there'll be some face saving for the Russians, Ukrainians, and NATO. Figure out some way for them all to back off and not take it all the way to a wider war. I would think that that's going to be that's in their interest anyway. So I'm expecting and a lot of people are going to die, but people have been sacrificed. People of all different kinds of colors and backgrounds and stuff have been sacrificed throughout human history. I mean, World War I, most of all those dead people were white people, and they were died by the hordes and hordes and hordes. And the powers that be that sent them out there to start the wars were able to stomach that, get over it, sell poppies, write poems, do whatever it is that they wanted to do to say thank you for your service and all that. But I don't think the death of a lot of people is going to really be the critical factor here. Probably more economic factors will come to play.
Mark, what do you think?
I think in this entire situation, I won't say Putin probably miscalculated how this is going to go for him, but I think his generals may have oversold how easy this was going to be. And he thought this thing was going to be over a weekend and no sanctions, be done and out. And he's been hit a lot harder than what he thinks. I think if they sit down at the negotiation table and you can just give a few of the demands that Putin's asking for and give him the chance to save face that he can brag about those demands, I think this thing will be over with like that.
Kent?
Yeah, I think I probably would agree with you, but I mean, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, depending on what Putin does in terms of the bombing. I mean, from what the headlines are today, that they tried to set up a ceasefire and corridor where people could get out, and that didn't even work out. I mean, so I think it's going to get worse, and I think I feel that we're going to get drawn in somehow. I mean, in some way, and the other thing is that maybe we should stay on this Zoom call until we figure it all out.
Well, we should do more episodes of this while we still can.
Right.
I hope you are wrong, Kent.
Well, what do you think? What do you think, Larry? What's your tea leaves tell you?
I think Putin is going to pour on the steam and try to wrap this up as soon as possible now. Perhaps maybe as quickly as in the next 2 weeks. And although we're pouring in all kinds of munitions now,
Right.
Keep it going for a while, but I think Putin now is forced into really getting much more aggressive about this, and perhaps more brutal, if you want to term it that way. But I don't think he wants this to go on that much longer. In terms of Biden, I mean, I don't see him getting America directly involved. I mean, maybe some of the crazies around him might persuade him to do that, but that's a whole different dangerous escalation that could lead, if not to nuclear war, at least to a much wider European war that's going to have all kinds of horrible casualties and masses of people killed and infrastructure destroyed. So I hope that Biden is not crazy enough to get the U.S. Directly involved. So John Woodford, Mark Collinsworth, Kent Garrett, myself, Larry Sparano of On Target with Larry Sparano. Thanks very much for being with us. And if we're all still here next week, we'll do an update. Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
See
Enjoy
you guys.
Thanks.